but dealing with questions of our time and the challenges of our time. It was some years ago I had returned from overseas. I think it was Bangkok to New York. We used to have a direct flight at that time, which is about 14 and a half hours, something like that. You have a few birthdays along the way, and one thing is for sure, you look like a passport picture when you get off. There's no problem recognizing you. But I got off that plane, and it's an early morning arrival, 6:30 or something like that, so you're just wandering around looking for your gate. And I wandered over to the gate, and there were people sitting there, and on the marquee, it gave a different flight. It wasn't to Atlanta, and I was headed home to Atlanta. So I looked at the lady at the corner, and I said to her, "Is this flight going to Atlanta, or what the marquee says, where it's headed?" She said, "No, it's going to Atlanta." I said, "Good to hear that, thank you." And I turned around and walked away. And I heard the patter of feet following me hurriedly. And then I was tapped on the shoulder, and it was the same lady. She said, "Excuse me, are you Ravi Zacharias?" And I looked at her and I said, "I'm afraid so." She said, "That's amazing. That's really amazing. I didn't know you had questions as well." That really happened. I can't make a story like that. And I thought to myself, did she really mean that? Was she just trying to be funny? Some years ago, there was a beautiful commercial. It started off with a simple question like, "How old is the universe?" And then more complex questions like that. And then, "Do you like pizza?" And a simple question like that. And the screen went black, and a kind of an ominous, mystical sound emerged, and a gradual emergence of a silhouetted motorbike. And it said, "Yamaha." It may not be the answer, but at least it's not another question. Good thinking. Questions. They haunt us, they stalk us, and ours is a time where questions are being thrown in every direction. And as Christian apologists, we begin to fear some of the questions because they're no longer easy. You can take a text out of a context, and an answer is demanded of you, and we do our best to respond. Tonight I'll have two of my colleagues, Michael Ramsden, our European director based in Oxford, and McAllister will be with us too as well. McAllister's son will be with us this time. Cameron was about to decide between Stuart and Cameron, but Cameron will be joining us. Sorry, Stuart, get even with me some of the time because Zacharias will be with us. It's Cameron McAllister, the younger, who's our young apologist doing a marvelous job, has a great love for literature. And so we'll have a convergence of answers really from a philosophical side and across a cultural side as well. Several years ago, I was reading an article in Atlantic Monthly, and they were talking about the changing values in American culture. I think it may have been even 20 some years ago. And it was called, as the values were changing, it was raising the issue of how are we going to find a source for answers when the value structure is changing. Because it gave us two propositions with which to start. The first was this: culture is an effort to provide a coherent set of answers to the existential situations that confront all of us human beings in the passage of our lives. Notice the assumption in the definition. It is a subtle assumption, but nobody would have noticed it's an assumption until you came into postmodern times. Because here it is telling us that culture is an effort to find a coherent set of answers to the existential questions that confront all of us human beings in the passage of our lives. I dare suggest to you that an average postmodernist will say to you, whoever told you we need to find a coherent set of answers? Why cannot we have an incoherent set of answers? In fact, a student at the University of Iowa, when William Lane Craig and I had done 3 days of open forums there, as they prepared for all the years for us to come, just before we came, they did a survey in the university on the 5 most important questions they could raise. And we did an open forum for about 2 hours, just taking those 5 questions. When my turn came to answer a question, the student went up to the microphone and she looked at me and said, "Who ever told you life had to be coherent? Where did you get this from? Is that not another attempt from the West to sort of force this upon the rest of the world and to find some kind of homogeneity, that you want a coherent set of answers in the West, therefore we have to find a coherent set of answers everywhere?" So I let her talk long enough, and then I just said to her, "I understand your question, ma'am, so can I ask you a question? When I'm answering you, can I be incoherent, or are you looking for a coherent answer from me?" No, it was like you threw a brick onto her forehead. She just looked at me, stunned, till it really dawned on her that even the postmodernist, willing to live with incoherence, demands a coherent answer from the counter perspective. We yearn for coherence. We like to bring all disciplines together. We like to find meaning. That's what courts of law are all about. That's what supposedly political theory is all about. Finding a coherent set of answers to the existential questions that confront all human beings in the passage of their lives. But then this article went on to say this: a genuine cultural revolution then is one that makes a decisive break with the shared meanings of the past, particularly those which relate to the deepest questions of the purpose and nature of human life. So a cultural revolution is underway when we have made a decisive break from the shared meanings of the past, particularly to do with questions on the purpose and nature of human life. Do you see where this article was headed? This is what culture is all about. This is what the revolution is all about. We no more have shared meanings of the past. Where are we going to turn to find a coherent set of answers on the nature and the purpose of human life? And it was fascinating how that ended in a tremendous interview done with various young people to show that the incoherence that had come into our society was actually having decimating consequences both internally and relationally. How did this all come about? It came about first with the mood of secularization. There are 3 moods that I really want to talk about. Secularization is defined thus: it is the process by which religious ideas, institutions, and interpretations have lost their social significance. Every word is important in that definition. It is a process, not a punctiliar moment. It is a process by which religious ideas, institutions, and interpretations have lost their social significance. And how real that is in the West today. You know, my wife has just, we were together in Indonesia this week. We just arrived yesterday. And she took a trip into Papua New Guinea. And there, even in the internal part of the country, the Muslim government in Indonesia is allowing Christians to open schools and educate their young. Allowing Christian schools to be started, even in the interior in Papua. Here, try introducing the message of Christianity through our school system, and you run the risk of one lawsuit after another, because that is enforcing a belief system as we live under this horrible illusion of neutrality. Wow. Secularization, the process by which religious ideas, institutions, and interpretations lost their social significance. Watch a television program and watch experts discussing some social issue. And you have a university president, you have a lawyer, you have a psychologist, you have a doctor, you have a social theorist, you have a philosophical ethicist, all of them, and you put in a reverend so-and-so in the middle of that panel. Who do you think the viewing audience will assume to be possibly unqualified and certainly prejudiced? All of the others will be deemed to be objective, but the reverend will be taken to be prejudiced and possibly unqualified. Secularization has had its moment now, after the process has taken root, where we assume that academics are objective, and the reverend, so is leading a prejudiced life on this. They have forgotten that most of these academics were trained in the Ivy League schools, which were started by Reverend so-and-so. Once they got and they evicted the nature of religion, like Harvard, for example, Veritas, single word. The motto years ago used to be Veritas Christo et Ecclesia, truth, Christ, the church. Now it's with its feet firmly planted in midair, Veritas, just hanging out there. Secularization. Somebody writing this tongue-in-cheek put it in these words: first dentistry was famous, then bicycles were chainless, and carriages were horseless, and many laws enforceless. Next, cookery was fireless, telegraphy was wireless, cigars were nicotineless, and coffee caffeineless. Soon oranges were seedless, budding green was weedless, the college boy was hatless, the proper diet fatless. New motor roads are dustless, the latest steel is rustless, our tennis courts are swordless, our new religion, godless. God has been evicted. You no longer can invoke an ontic referent, an outside objective point of reference from which moral reasoning was actually engendered in all other. Once upon a time we called it natural law. And when you talk about even the framing of this nation, we talked about self-evident truths that were given to us and endowed by our Creator. Today those ideas are no longer self-evident. They are no longer endowed. We have a totally subjectivized way of thinking. And what has happened is secularization has had its sway, and a deadly result has been its entailment. Let me sustain this. Steve Turner, the brilliant English journalist, writing sarcastically and with a touch of humor about what secularization has actually done, penned these brilliant words. We believe now in Marx, Freud, and Darwin. We believe everything is okay as long as you don't hurt anyone to the best of your definition of hurt and to the best of your definition of knowledge. We believe in sex before, during, and after marriage. We believe in the therapy of sin. We actually believe that adultery is fun. We only believe that taboos are taboo. We believe that everything is getting better despite evidence to the contrary. The evidence must be investigated, and you can prove anything with evidence. We believe there's something in horoscopes, UFOs, and bent spoons. Jesus was a good man, just like Buddha, Muhammad, and ourselves. He was a good moral teacher, although we think some of his good morals were basically bad. We believe that all religions are basically the same, at least the ones that we read were. They all believe in love and goodness. They only differ on matters of creation, sin, heaven, hell, God, and salvation. We believe that after death comes the nothing, because when you ask the dead what happens, they say nothing. If death is not the end, and if the dead have lied, then it's compulsory heaven for all, excepting perhaps Hitler, Stalin, and Genghis Khan. We believe in Masters and Johnson. What's selected is average, what's average is normal, what's normal is good. We believe in total disarmament. We believe there are direct links between warfare and bloodshed. Americans should beat their guns into tractors, and the Russians will be sure to fall. We believe that man is essentially good. It's only his behavior that lets him down. It's the fault of society. Society is the fault of conditions. Conditions are the fault of society. We believe that each man must find truth that is right for him, and reality will adapt accordingly. The universe will readjust, history will alter. We believe there is no absolute truth, accepting the truth that there is no absolute truth. We believe in the rejection of creeds and the flowering of individual thought. And then he puts this postscript: if chance be the father of all flesh, disaster is his rainbow in the sky. And when you hear state of emergency, sniper kills 10, youths go looting, bomb blasts school, it is but the sound of man worshipping his maker. If chance be the father of all flesh, disaster is his rainbow in the sky. And when you hear state of emergency, sniper kills 10, youths go looting, bomb blast school, it's but the sound of man worshipping his maker. If you're the random product of time plus matter plus chance, out of flux, nothing but flux, out of a deterministic primordial soup comes nothing more than just a chemical determinism, how do we even talk about violence and evil? In what terms do we define them? It was Friedrich Nietzsche who who said since God had died in the 19th century, the 20th century would become the bloodiest century in history. We killed more people in the 20th century in warfare than the previous 19 centuries put together. When I made this statement in the Ukraine a few months ago, the president of the secular university, sitting next to the professors there, while their troops were rampaging in other places around the country, as the former Soviet Union raising its demagogic head once again, the president looked at the professor next to him and nodded and muttered something. I could just about infer what he was saying. We are seeing it happening all over again now. Secularization. Where do we look for moral absolutes? Let me tell you how this works very gently and yet systemically till it has done its damage. When I moved to Atlanta in the 1980s, there was a historic case going on a pornographer who was supposed to be producing such horrific stuff that it made Playboy magazine look tame. And he was on trial, and so I was following the script every day in what was going on in the trial. I first found out that it took them days to select a jury because the man defending him did not want anybody who went to church to be on the jury. Because people who go to church, it said, have opinions on pornography. We want people who don't have any opinions on pornography so they can be objective. They were really looking for moral zombies. And I guess they found a group, and the jury was found. And so the lawyer, brilliant in his discourse, would look at a person testifying against his client and would look at the witness and he would say to him, I have a question for you. Did you ever in your life go into an art gallery? Yes. Did you ever pay to go into an art gallery? Yes. Did you ever pay to go into an art gallery where there were paintings of the great masters of art? Yes. Did you ever go into one of those and pay to get into one of those where there were paintings of unclothed, disrobed people? Yeah. Will you then tell this jury why you paid to go into an art gallery where there were paintings of disrobed people, and you call that art, and you call my client stuff pornography? Will you explain the difference to the jury? You know, how do you really do that? The lawyer is not looking for some clever answers out there. He's going to stop you in your tracks. He has done a fundamental explanation with a logical flaw. The logical flaw is known as one of the foundational laws of logic, which being interpreted as this: just because two things have one thing in common doesn't mean they have everything in common. This is the law that is flaunted again and again and again. Something like this could be said: elephants have ears, I have ears, therefore I'm an elephant. That could be uttered in this kind of description. I thought to myself, you know, if I were a witness and the lawyer threw this at me, what would I say? He's not looking for some philosophical explanation on ethical systems and so on. But I would love to invite a lawyer like that for a meal and say something like this to him. Have you ever read the biography of Michelangelo, who started to paint disrobed people? Have you ever read it, sir? And I don't know what his answer would be. Let's say, are you aware that when he first started to paint disrobed people, his teacher took him aside and said, Michael, I have a question for you. Why are you doing this? And Michelangelo said, because I want to see man as God sees man. The teacher paused and looked at him and said, just remember, you are not God. He put enough of a caution to remind him that there had to be a block somewhere in this kind of reasoning, else it will move into a way of thinking that we see no difference between an artistic expression and the provocative intent of a pervert whose sole purpose is to so plant the human body in front of young minds, and now younger and younger and younger, till they so prostitute these young minds and pervert them and get them enslaved to an idea and to be possessed by this kind of a passion that marriages are broken up, relationships are ruptured, people will spend money and money after money after money till they are totally broke and find themselves so helpless for what has now been planted in their memory bank, so that every time they look upon a person of the opposite sex, nothing but the rewind button goes, and the nudity picture comes into their mind again and again, and no one human being can satisfy it. My daughter, Naomi, works in rescuing women and children from the sex trafficking industry. She burned out on it. So young, she just burned out. The lady who first started to work with her in Bangkok was from New Zealand. She burned out and left. And this high burnout rate of seeing what is done to women in this trade and in this industry. And she said to me, Dad, in almost every case that I see, the men who use this and are involved in it are men who first got trapped into it in the pornography industry. And she's been pleading with me for quite a while to write a book on it. I said, I really don't even want to get my mind into that kind of sordid stuff. She said, I'll write on what is happening out there. You write on what it is intended to be like. We have to get it out there. She says, I don't think the average man knows what he does to his wife, to his spouse, when he is trapped in this kind of wickedness. It shatters the image of a young bride or a young woman, and she finds that she's replaced by pictures of somebody else. C.S. Lewis dealt with this idea, and so here's this pornographer justifying this. But you see, here's what I want to say to you. When that woman sits in front of the lens of a camera, purely for this exploitation and using her body this way, something within her ought to cause her to raise her arms up and says, stop all of this. I can't do this anymore. But the reason she won't is because when secularization has done the damage that it is going to do, it will produce a generation without a sense of shame. That's what we are looking at in the secularized consciousness, a total lack of shame. You show me a man without a sense of shame, and I will show you a man with a huge sword in his hand, lopping off heads, and standing in the great theater of the visual expression to say, this is what I am doing, and I'm doing it brazenly, when something within his conscience ought to say, you have just defaced the image of God. That's what murder was all about in Genesis 9. Murder was prohibited because it is an attack upon the imago Dei, attack upon the image of God. Of course, the Islamic world won't talk about us being created in the image of God. It is a unique Judeo-Christian truth. So man is dehumanized as being an expendable quantity in the pursuit of some supposedly noble idea which does ignoble things in the process. I say to you, young people, young men, what C.S. Lewis said, shame is like a scalding drink. If you touch it, it'll burn you, but you drink it over a cup properly, and it'll nourish and ultimately do what it is intended to do. Shame is intended to bring you and me to a point of recognizing we are sinners before God and need to be forgiven. Shame is a legitimate expression. Our society is now bereft of shame, where we glory in the wrong and condemn in the right and think we are now called progressives. But actually, it is the ultimate form of regression. Secularization was launched as a great idea, but it is found out it is bankrupt at the core. Let me just give you one caveat. I'm not arguing for religious enforcement in the land, no. But I am saying, if you evict the ideas that helped us frame freedom, if you reject those ideas, then you have lost the idea of what freedom itself is intended to be. And that's when secularism becomes a kind of a hegemonous, in your face kind of a worldview. That's what is happening today. No shame. Second, we come to pluralization. Pluralization is there's a competing number of worldviews that's available to its members, and no worldview is dominant. Pluralization is a competing number of worldviews available to its members, and no worldview is dominant. What that really means is There's a plurality of options out there. Here again, it's a good thing. Options will always be there. And America is a voluntarily pluralistic society. We are wonderfully pluralistic in culinary options. You can walk through the streets of Los Angeles and see a fast food outlet where a Korean is selling kosher tacos. Wow, that's quite a pluralistic culinary skill. When I came to Canada, I was 20 years old. There was only one Indian restaurant, which was an embarrassment to the Indians. Horrible meal that I took my wife to, and I ate that meal. I said, this has no resemblance to Indian cuisine. Don't believe you've just had an Indian meal. Today, if you go to Toronto, you'll get the finest Indian restaurants anywhere in the world. When I moved to Canada, there were 500 Indians in Toronto. Today, there are 500,000 Indians in Toronto. When you arrive in Toronto, you're more likely to see an Indian than you're to see a Caucasian. If you shout out in the Toronto airport, Mr. Singh, you're probably going to have 20 or 30 look back and say, did you call me? If you say John, you'll have to come to Oklahoma Christian University. Mr. John's out here. How society has changed, tremendously changed. Pluralism is a good thing, you know. People ask me, why do Indians die young? I said, because he's preparing the chefs out there for the marriage supper of the Lamb. for all the culinary delights. You know, when you go out and have a meal right now, and you say to yourself, what do we eat? Do we eat Chinese? Do we eat Korean? Do we eat a hamburger? Do we get some dull English recipe in front of you, apart from fish and chips or whatever it is, you know? Or are you going to get Thai? Are you going to get Indian? You have all these options now. What a wonderful privilege that is. My taste buds are something for which I thank God every day. It's marvelous to have these taste buds. I think losing a taste buds would be a horrible thing if everything tastes the same. God gives us that delight. But if pluralism is extrapolated into meaning relativism, then you are in the process to cultural disintegration. If pluralism is extrapolated into relativism, then you are on the way to cultural extinction with no shared meanings of the past. It's been quite a while since I've given this illustration, so let me see if I can remember it, then I'll move to my final thought. In the early days when I was starting out to speak, I was in California, and I'll never forget preparing my talk, and the maid was in the room fluffing up the pillows and the bed sheets and all of that, getting it ready. And she said, so are you a lecturer? I said, yeah. She said, what are you speaking on today? I said, I'm dealing with a philosophical issue. She said, that's good. I'm into metaphysics myself. I said, boy, where have I come? If the maid is into metaphysics, I'm going to be into some deadly metaphysicians of my audience today. That's the way it was. But after I finished speaking one of my talks, a professor came up with his students and he said to me, you're from India. Your ancestors were Hindu, and you have become a Christian. What happened to you? Why did you do this? I said, what about you? He said, I am a Hindu. I said, you're an American. You're from the West. You had a different heritage. You become a Hindu. What happened to you? So we started, isn't that interesting? He was picking me up for why I departed from my, quote, heritage. He never thought for a moment about his. So he said, here's what I want to talk to you about. He said, look, why don't you speak one night on why I'm not a Hindu? And I'll bring my whole philosophy class and they'll tear you apart at the end of it. I said, that's supposed to be a welcoming invitation. I said, look, I don't want to do that. And students are just on their toes listening to this. I said, I don't want to do that. I said, I'll tell you what I'll do, sir. I will speak to you on why I am a Christian, and you bring your whole class, and I'm happy if they try to tear me apart. He said, no, I want you. I said, no, I'll speak on why I'm a Christian, because that'll give you the answers, why I'm not anything else, and you can try to tear me apart. So he came, and he sat there and left with his arms folded like that, looking like a typical philosopher. As someone said, philosophers can easily become doodlers with words. And so there he was, doodling with words as I was trying to give my talk, and I could just see his hand like this and just shaking his head and whispering to his student, I don't want to listen. So at the end of it, he came up to the front and he said, you know what, I've just seen you do the greatest damage to pantheistic belief that I've ever seen any man do. I said, really? He said, yeah. I said, why? And he said, you see, and I said, you know, sir, let me tell you something. For me to try to explain and defend to you what I have just said, I'm not interested in impressing your students. You may want to do that, I'm not interested in. Let's go and have lunch. And you and I will talk. I'll present my case. You try to tell me why it is I have done the damage that you think I've done, and we can carry on the discussion. He said, can I bring the professor of psychology with me? I've never figured out why. He wanted somebody to study both of us or not. I said, all right, but I'm going to talk to you, not to him. I said, I'm going to talk to you. He said, that's fine. So we met. And he came and the discussion began. And here's what he said to me. He said, Mr. Zacharias, you know there are only two kinds of logic. When somebody's opening statement is wrong, where do you go with it? And I wasn't going to give away my hand that soon. I said, go ahead. He said, you see, there are two kinds of logic. The first kind of logic is the either-or logic. It's called the law of non-contradiction. And he's drawing it out to me in our placemats. He's taking my placemat, the psychologist's placemat, his placemat, the neighbor's placemat. He's drawing all of this, giving names of thinkers and so on, going through the either-or law of non-contradiction. And he said, you know, this is the Western way of thinking. I said, no, it's not. He said, yes, it is. I said, no, it's not. He said, yes, it is. I said, no, it's not. He said, how can you say no, it's not? I said, carry on, keep moving. So he said, and then there is a both-and set of propositions. It's not either this or that. It's the Hegelian dialectic. Take a thesis with its antithesis, spawns together a synthesis. Marx used that with an employer and an employee, put them together, find a classless society. They never ever show you a classless society, but they at least like to talk about it theoretically, that Marx had his dialectic. So it's either or and both and. And he said, you know what you've actually done, Mr. Zacharias? When you were studying Hinduism, you talked about all of the contradictions that go on between the Vedas and the Gita and this and this and this. He said, you know what you were doing? You were using a Western logical system of either or by which to judge an Eastern philosophy which submits to both and. The Eastern philosophers are not afraid of contradiction. They accept the contradiction. They are systemically contradictory. You should have judged it by an Eastern way of thinking, not a Western way of thinking. And he was waxing eloquent with this either or, both and. When I'm studying Hinduism, I should use the both and. I shouldn't be using either or. That was my logical blunder. Finally, I had no place on a placemat to do anything. He used them all. So I pulled up the placemats where he'd done the either or and done the both and. I said, I have a question for you, sir. Are you telling me when I am studying pantheism, I either use the both-and system of logic or nothing else? Is that right? Those of you who laughed can explain it to those who didn't laugh. Are you telling me that I either use the both-and system of logic or nothing else? Is that right? You know what he said to me? This is one of those times where a camera would have been so handy. He said, it's quite amazing. The either or does seem to emerge, doesn't it? I said, yes, sir. In fact, I've got some shocking news for you. Even in India, we look both ways before we cross the street. Either the bus or me, not both of us. You know what the professor of psychology said? He said, I think we should leave now. This discussion is over. You see what he was doing? He was using the either-or with which to prove the both-and. If both-and was right, why was he not allowing me to use both the either-or and the both-and? He was eliminating me on the basis of a presumption that the either-or, the laws of logic, do apply to reality. And what he absolutely missed, completely missed, you take Shankara, the leading Indian exponent of the Vedas, leading Indian philosopher, Shankaracharya. His entire way of debate was in using the law of non-contradiction, trying to decimate the opposition if it had any systemically contradictory ideas. Gautama Buddha was born a Hindu. He left Hinduism and went into Buddhism because he denied couple of fundamental Hindu precepts. He was using the law of non-contradiction. Islamic scholars are committed to the law of non-contradiction. To say Easterners don't believe in the law of non-contradiction is to caricature Eastern philosophy. Ah, yes, they do go with contradictions, but not if they were to submit to the primary documents from which they actually glean some of their philosophy. And ladies and gentlemen, if you live a life of ethical contradiction, it will burn you. It will burn you. It was Alexander Solzhenitsyn who said, he said, between good and evil there is an irreconcilable contradiction, like the 2 points of an electric current. You cross them and you will burn, he said, and we in the Soviet Union have lost that distinction between good and evil. He said this at Harvard University. We've lost now the definition of the sacredness of the body. We've lost it. We've lost the definition of the sacredness of a married vow. We've lost the definition of the sacredness of filing your taxes with honor and truth. We've lost all of these ideas with the sheer pragmatism that has told us pluralization has ultimately led to systemic schizophrenia. Andrew Fletcher, the Scottish political activist, wrote the poem, "Let me rule over the world, let me write the songs of a nation, I don't care who writes its laws. Let me write the songs of a nation, I don't care who writes its laws." Our rock musicians, our songwriters are seeing the hollowness of which we are living with now. And so when the King Crimson Rock Group writes this, Cat's Foot, Iron Claw, neurosurgeons scream for more, from paranoias, poison door, 21st century schizoid man, blood rag, barbed wire, politicians, funeral pyre, innocents raped with napalm fire, 21st century schizoid man, death seed, blind man's greed, poet starving, children bleed, nothing he's got, he really needs, 21st century schizoid man. Now notice what he said, they say, the walls on which the prophets wrote is cracking at the seams, upon the instruments of death the sunlight brightly gleams, will no one lay memorial wreath as silence drowns the screams, between the iron gates of faith the seeds of time are sown, and watered by the deeds of those who know and who are known. Knowledge is a deadly friend when no one sets the rules. The fate of all mankind, I see, is in the hands of fools. Confusion will be my epitaph as I crawl the cracked and broken path. If we make it, we can all sit back and laugh, but I'm afraid tomorrow I'll be crying. Our secular academic system has toyed with the laws of logic and no longer believe in the law of non-contradiction, and we are on a collision course with reality now. Secularization, no shame. Pluralization, no reason. Finally, privatization. It ends up with no meaning. This is where it breaks down. Privatization, breakdown with no meaning. And in that breakdown is where I see the opening for the gospel. Let me just tell you what I mean here. You see, you and I think if we have unbridled pleasure, we will find fulfillment. When you see anybody who has lived with unbridled pleasure, you will see emptiness and hollowness. I wrote a book on an imaginary conversation between Oscar Wilde and Jesus and Pascal, because the funerals of Wilde and Pascal were held in the same church in Paris. And in that particular church, Pascal's jacket still hangs. And if you look at the jacket, there's pinned in that jacket his testimony of his conversion in one word: fire. He was turned ablaze in his conversion of Jesus Christ, through Jesus Christ. And now you've got Wilde's funeral going on in there. And what is happening? Not a single bar of music for a hedonist. If you see his grave in Paris, it's a giant phoenix. He chose a verse from the book of Job to put on his grave marker. Why would a hedonist wrote a book on suffering to talk about his life. And as he's lying in bed, he looks at his lover, Robbie Ross, and he says, Robbie, I have a question for you. When you loved one of those little boys, one of those young boys, did you ever love one of those young boys for their own sake? Why was a philosopher looking for the meaning of love on his deathbed? Did you love any one of those young boys for their own sake? And Robert Ross says, no, I didn't, Oscar. He said, neither did I. Bring me a priest, he says, bring me a priest. And in his ballad of Reading Jail, he says, only the blood of Christ is able now to cleanse this heart of mine. It's a powerful piece of poetry when he was in jail. You see, breakdown of meaning is something that is absolutely at a point then where you end up with total hopelessness when there is no purpose and no meaning left in your life. And I'm seeing if I have this little piece of poetry here. It's been a long while since I've quoted this. When I was a young man in Toronto in my 20s, it was a snowy night and I was driving on the main highway 401. And I saw a young boy sort of half swaggering on his feet, and I said, somebody's going to run over this young man. I pulled up on the side of the road and I got out and I talked to him. He said, would you give me a ride, sir? I said, yes, I will. Where do you live? And I could smell the liquor on him, and he was still talking clearly, but I could tell he was beginning to fade. I said, you know, give me your name. He said, my name is Warren Lusthouse. I said, Warren, you're in no shape to talk right now, but I want to talk to you. I'm heading out of town for some meetings. I'll call you when I get there. Let's get together. He said, please do that. Please do that. I need help. I dropped him off at his home, walked him to the door, got into my car, went for my week of meetings, and came back and tried to contact him. He burned himself to death in his home. And I was given this poetry that he wrote before he had died. Lost in a world of darkness, without a guiding light, seeking a friend to help, my struggling, feeling plight. So all of you good people just go on passing by, leaving me with nothing but this lonely will to die. For somewhere in this lonely world of sorrow and of woe, there's a place for me to hide, but where I do not know. For no matter where I go, I never will escape the devil's reaching, clutching hand of the drink of fermented grape. So I pray that out of my grief and anguish, perhaps some wandering boy will see and build his own life in this world, strong and good and free. He had to have a brilliant mind to write that stuff. But he went into a habit and broke it. To you young men and women, I say, where are you going to find your meaning? Are you going to find your meaning in the coherence of God's will, the sacredness of your life, or are you going to find it in the incoherence of the world that retains a selective sovereignty over the choices that it makes, moment by moment by moment? And so I see secularization with no shame, pluralization with no reason, privatization with no meaning. And I just want to close with this. Is this really new? No. Listen, in Genesis chapter 4, Cain murdered his brother and had no remorse. And God said to him before that, he said, you know what, you do what's right. If you do what's right, you'll be accepted. If you don't do what's right, sin is crouching at the door, desires to have you. You must have dominion over it. Your choice is sin on that which is right in the eyes of God. Early in Genesis, tablets, and he draws blood. Genesis chapter 3, a couple says, has God really spoken? Is there an absolute? Is there an absolute? So there's no shame in the young boy. The question of reason in the parents. And finally, as Abraham and Lot come in Genesis chapter 12, and Abraham moves towards the direction of becoming a man of the tent and the altar, transitory nihilism, transitoriness of life and sacredness of life, and Lot goes into the son of God, lives a life of pleasure and paid the price, at least his family paid the price in all that he did. Our choice really is between the city of God and the city of man. And which city are you going to live by? You know, I turned 69 last week. It's no fun. I've never worked as hard as I am these days, my family will tell you. I'm on the road over 200 days a year, and with a broken back, it gets tough. But I am totally committed to making a difference in this world, and I will keep going as long as God gives me breath in my body. I don't go anywhere in the world but that somebody says to me, those books, those podcasts, your teammates, that just thinking article, that message, that quote saved my life. When my wife was in Papua, a 100-year-old man said to her, I listen to those YouTube talks every day. 100-year-old man. We're going to do what God's called us to do. You do the same and be in this world of secularized consciousness and a pluralized way of thinking and a privatized. Show what a life is like when it understands shape, what a life is like when it understands reason, what a life is like when it understands meaning. And ladies and gentlemen, I want to tell you, our youth in the world are hungering for that. And more we see people writing from many, many parts of the globe, China, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Jordan, Israel, name a country, and somebody will write and say, thank you for helping me. Thank you for writing this book. I can't go anywhere without getting involved in somebody's life who holds my hand and says, please help me. I really need to get life in order. And I'll stop with that, just to tell you, secularization has its strength, but if it hates the sacred completely, it'll break society down with shamelessness. Pluralization extrapolated into relativism will lack reason and build in systemic contradiction which breaks down all conversation and meaning. Finally, privatization, where we are forced to keep our faith in our private world and only bring out into the public world what society allows us to bring. That's what America tells us. Keep your faith private. Why must you keep your faithlessness public and we keep my faith private? Place for intelligent dialogue, kind dialogue, loving dialogue. And I still believe the great days are going to come in my head because of universities like yours that raise up young people to think God's thoughts after Him and do God's will in their lives. Things will turn around one day and you and I can look back and say, God did it because His truth is eternal